Good afternoon. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and to our Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you are in person or whether you are virtual. We certainly appreciate you. Today, we are super pleased to welcome Mr. Walch, who will be talking to us about the Indian Termination. So I'm going to bring up Mr. Walch right now.
Thank you, Joy, and good afternoon. I'm glad to be here with you today. As Joy mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the Indian Termination Act, which is a major change in the country's policy towards its Native American citizens that began during the Eisenhower presidency. This began with an article in the Stanford Review many years ago. I'll tell you how many I've got on the road. On this subject, it's been there are been cited a number of times since then, so it's very well known in that field. And I'll be addressing a number of things about that. I've got some slides to be looking through. Have the benefit of looking at them instead of me during this presentation. And I'll begin by saying I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about this topic. My day job, if you will, I'm really a tax lawyer for a large law firm that's based in Utah. And I have to say, I do speak on tax topics in a number of places, although I have to say, I hesitate to mention that much. People find out tax attorney, those have the accounting license, next line, I usually get peers. Well, it's been nice talking to you. And it goes from there. So this is a more engaging one for me, and I hope it will be for you as well. So Samantha, with that, let's go on to our first slide to talk about the termination policy. We need to do some background on the history of this country's policy towards Native Americans. And that actually goes back to the earliest European contact with Native Americans. As you can see on the slide there, we begin what says the early contact. The policy was no means consistent because each of the European powers are southwest, now the eastern parts of the United States, the British, the French, and the Dutch, all have rather different Indian policies, ways of dealing with the natives. They weren't all consistent, and actually didn't always recognize, at least early going, that the Indians were all one group. If there's one thing I hope I'll mention now, so it's clear later on, we can never really talk about the Indians as the Indians any more than we can talk about Europeans being one group or one country. The country currently has 573 recognized Indian tribes. And so they did a lot of things differently. Some of them were very friendly with each other, some of them were not very friendly with each other. And so there's a wide spectrum of beliefs, activities, methods of doing things. And European powers often expect the natives to be able to figure out the difference between European powers at the same time. They did a really lousy job of figuring out the difference between the natives. However, both groups tend to be, European groups are fairly small and nearly gone. And the natives actually proved themselves quite adept at being able to what would later become known as triangulation in foreign policy, frankly being able to play off groups against each other. That continued for quite some time. The early interaction between the colonial powers and the natives tended to be based on issues like trade and alliances, like getting the natives to agree with them and disagree with some others, and try to maintain peace between the parties and to protect each other's settlements. The parties were generally dealing with roughly equal powers at that time. So they often did. A lot of these arrangements were not very formal. And that situation began to be complicated more and more as more and more European settlers came to the Americas, which increased the pressures in a lot of ways on the natives, began taking away not buffalo hunters. They were actually agrarian. They tended to be fairly sedentary. They farmed areas. They would move around to do hunting and fishing and other things. They tended to largely be crop raisers. Just the last ones to be subjugated were the ones that Hollywood fell in love with, who were hunting buffalo for the most part of their economy. Like most of them were agrarian, but more and more Europeans and more of the lands that natives were farming ended up getting claimed by others. And so that began to be more difficult. And beginning in about the time of the French and Indian War, 1763, the European powers began to want to more formalize their arrangements with the natives. And so that's when treaties began, though for the most part, it's really confusing for a few years because some treaties were done between states and certain natives within their boundaries. Others were done by the Continental Congress. Okay. It became very hard for the natives to figure out who they were actually dealing with, frankly, because those forms of government were very different from their own. And there was no real consistency in how it was being done. So the next real step in that is with the adoption of the Constitution when it took effect in 1789. So Samantha, we can jump to the next slide real quick. This one, the federal government authority over Indians contains all two of the constitutional provisions dealing with the Indians. The first one has to do with how the census would be counted and whether Indians would be included in that. I'm sorry for this lack of clarity, and I don't like to give offense to any of my native friends, but I often find when speaking, I will tend to use the terms Indians and tribes and natives and nations interchangeably. That's just because most of the legal precedents out there, the statutory languages and case law, prefer the terms Indians and tribes. Most of the Indians and tribes I know prefer the terms natives and nations to be much more accurate and describe their position. So I will go back and forth. Sorry for the confusion, but that was happening a number of times during the presentation. Like I said, this first one was having to do with whether Indians would be included in the nation's census count for then apportioning taxes and determining representation in Congress. And the Constitution there took the position that if Indians were subject to state taxation, they would be included, otherwise they would not. Okay. That one hasn't been a big player in Indian law since then. The next one, though, really has, because you might notice, this is the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. It's the one that's been the main source of federal government extending its powers into state and other affairs by its ability to regulate commerce. And you'll notice the phrase that regulate commerce among several states that's been used for that purpose is also the phrase that says they have to have the same authority with the Indian tribes. So what that did was give the federal government exclusive power of dealing with the Indians, which at least made it a lot clearer to all the players involved as to who could actually make treaties with the Indian tribes and who could not. Interestingly, there are still a few state-created Indian reservations and state-created recognized tribes in the northeastern part of the country even now that predate this. But since that time, it's been exclusively the purview of the federal government. Let's go back to the previous slide and we'll finish that. When the federal government got this exclusive authority over dealing with the Indians, treaty making began becoming much more common with the Indians. The United States regulators have much more of an incentive to do that because by then, most of the native nations that have been along the eastern seaboard weren't there. The illness had taken lives of most of them, and most of the others had recruited inward because they were getting outnumbered. And after the French and Indian War in 1763, England set the ridge of the Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains as the boundary. Natives were not supposed to be east of that. Non-natives were not supposed to be west of that. That didn't work out very well. But there were a lot of treaties made with the natives to try to move westward. That was a freedom of treaty provision. Peace arrangements were like I said, moving the tribes westward was a big issue to keep opening land for more and more European settlers to come in and settle. One other thing I'd like to touch on this one, because ever since the Constitution was adopted, each president has felt any Indian tribe should be like other international treaties, receive advice and consent. One problem throughout the treaty era, which you can see is almost 100 years long, was how many treaties would be negotiated with the natives. And as soon as the treaty was signed by the treaty commissioners and the natives, people would start, Americans would start taking advantage of the land cessions in those treaties. Unfortunately, a whole lot of them would then be sent back to Congress for ratification and not get ratified. So the illegal kind of no man's land, who owned what, and whether the tribe is actually recognized by the government or not, could be in limbo. In some cases, it still is because of that. One other thing that happened in the early days after the Constitution was the creation of Trade and Intercourse Act, which was trade with the Indians, because the problems that were resulting from that was to be done only by license from the federal government. That was a nice thought. It was widely ignored in practice, and so that concept didn't last very long. Although the United States government did generally hang on to the power that only they can make treaty relationships. Next point I want to touch on is some cases in the early 1830s having to do with the removal of Cherokee tribes from largely the state of Georgia, which had refused to A, recognize their existence in Georgia, and B, refused to recognize the prevalence of the federal government in dealing with them. And there were three cases in the early 1830s which didn't stop with trail or tiered relocation of Cherokees in the Indian country, what's now Oklahoma. But the Supreme Court of the United States did rule that Native Americans were, as they defined it, domestic dependent nations. The important thing there, legally speaking, was they found to be sovereign entities that recognized that the Native nations had, even before there was a United States, they had the methods of, forming a more perfect union, providing presence and liberty to themselves, their posterity, providing common defense, etc. All of those things. They had ways of educating the young, punishing discriminants. They did all of those things. And so for that time, the Supreme Court recognized that treaty making with the natives was a cession of certain rights that the natives already had in the United States, and anything that was not ceded, the tribes still had. Tribes can still control their internal affairs and continue to do so by and large. One other note on treaties, Samantha, if you could go ahead 2 slides, please. Yep, that's the one. This slide is on treaty making. I picked it out because I knew it's basis for manufacturing honors, so I knew about this one. You'll see here is the last page, almost the last page of the treaty, and it's signed there at the bottom by Governor of Washington Territory and Superintendent of Indian Affairs of that territory. Now, if we look at the next slide, we get to see who's signing it on the other side. A few interesting things from that as to how effective treaties work. The first one, if you can read it, the first line up there is by somebody who is not nominated the head chief of the next person in the tribe. That was an issue in and of itself because most tribes did not have that kind of position. The United States wanted to have them so they could have a single person to negotiate a treaty with. But like I said, tribes did not have that concept of one person to speak the entire tribe. Most of them had a very democratic form of governance where if these people were adult male, everybody had participate in council, and tribes did not have much of a means of coercing their decisions on people who didn't want to have to agree with them. Okay, they were trying to do things much more by consensus. That didn't work in treaty negotiations. So you see, they created the position of the head chief, which I said did not really exist in terms of visibility and speak for others. And then you notice a whole lot of people that are signing by their X mark. Okay, These people didn't have written language, and so they didn't write. And actually, in practice, they didn't even make their X mark. I just ran and built one more slide and see that page wasn't even all. They began calling it touching the stick, meaning somebody, one of the treaty commissioners in the United States, would actually make their X mark, and you're supposed to touch it. And, well, that's happening. So what did they knew was going on during these treaty negotiations is frequently a question. One other thing I mentioned, let's go ahead to the next one. One other thing I want to mention, national treaty negotiations, also a big issue when we get to the termination policy, is the fact that treaties were very much like contracts, a species of contract, and typically the Indians were in a treaty would be ceding their claims to certain areas of land, and in the 1850s, most of them were being moved to Indian country, called Indian country, which is now most of the state of Oklahoma, or after the 1850s, it began getting reduced to reservations of land in their own areas. The interesting thing on these is the policies developed with this termination policy is, again, the Indians would typically perform a hunt. They would be making land cession now. In exchange for that, the United States would be making a lot of representation to provide a certain amount of payments each year, to provide flour. A lot of the trees would have the United States provide blacksmith for them to maintain their lives. A lot of them would have to provide the dog. One interesting thing, I'm the member of the board of trustees of the Urban Indian Center in Salt Lake, in Utah, which administers most Indian health services programs in the state. That's there because a lot of treaties have a provision that says the United States will provide a dog to the natives. As courts have construed that for years, the concept of providing a doctor in the 1800s has been translated into that. What that meant was you were supposed to be the same kind of medical care that most American citizens had at that time. And that's why the Indian Health Service even now, which is to provide a lot of those treaty rights to Indians. Indian performance on treaties are usually upfront, the United States usually later. Next era is allotment assimilation. In 1871, the United States stopped making Indian treaties with natives, and reservations made after that time were done by executive orders by the president. A lot of reservations are still created, but frequently the challenge is that it changed the concept legally in that like I said, the treaties recognized that the natives were reserving all the rights they weren't giving them in the treaty. Executive orders were very much with the position that the grant of rights from the United States to the natives, as in the natives ostensibly didn't have any, if they didn't have a treaty by that time. That becomes another issue too. The big part of this era too was in 1887, Congress adopted what was called the Dawes Act, the Allotment Act. The United States is being frankly very frustrated over the unwillingness of the natives to go fence land, plow, and have no farms. That was the American idea of what being American actually was. They weren't doing that, and they needed to do it. So Congress talked about the idea that, okay, what we're going to do is take all this land within reservations. A lot of people say, well, some of the land with the reservation companies wasn't capable of being farmed, and other people wanted to get it. This is the way to do it. The allotment clause, what it did was give each adult Indian male 160 acres of land within the reservation. And when that's all done, it freed up the rest of the reservation land to save on settlement by non-Indians. Interesting side note, notice that it was 160 acres. You think back to the Homestead Act of 1862 or 63, which had a cost. An American male could homestead 320 acres and get married. The couple would claim 640. The allotment act natives was 160, no added in that spouse. So a lot of the country's Indian reservations began to be chopped up at that point, and having large landholdings by non-natives who were not
also with private governments with very little ability to, take care of the needs of their people because they didn't control their land base anymore. It also had the effect of reducing even after counting the land set aside reservation. It was only about 2/3 of the country's land within reservation being owned by non-Indians. That's also the area when education involved largely forced boarding schools. The idea was that if Indians were going to become Americans, they had to get away from their tribal culture, and so education then was done in away from their reservations. The United States opened a number of boarding schools. The Indians that were prohibited from speaking their native tongue, couldn't grow their hair long, etc. To try to make them very different from where they were. That did not, sociologically speaking, go very well for the natives. And that led to the next era, which is Indian reorganization. Beginning in the late 20s and largely beginning with Franklin Roosevelt's administration, the United States tried to try something different with Indian policy. It was adopted was Indian Reorganization Act in 1834, which allowed tribal governments to organize along the lines of the United States government, 3 branches, or a business corporation, board of directors and shareholders kind of thing. And it had some effects of giving tribal governments or preserving tribal culture, but not all the tribes were really enamored with that because the forms of government offered to them were very different from what they had for many, many centuries. The country's largest tribe, in fact, not those refused to organize under the Indian Reorganization Act because the land was completely foreign to their form of governance, to their way of running their tribe. So that changed the trajectory of Indian policy in the country, but not always, better, but not necessarily good. Now, let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the things that began pointing the country toward termination policy, which is what I need to leave more time for, so go there right now. Beginning about in World War II era, a number of shifts because of the very major war effort led to a lot of rethinking of Indian policy. Not necessarily good thinking, but different thinking. World War II had a couple of effects, some effects sociologically, which were there's a lot more integration in American society because a lot of people otherwise never would have been in contact with each other ended up in the same troop or shipping on the same ship or whatever. Of all of the demographics of this country. So, from a Native perspective, it moved a lot of natives off reservation for that was different. I want to add one other insight here too that plays into this. Most of us who are descended from European immigrants, I'm an Oregon native, and as a kid studying the Oregon Trail, unemployed as he was on the Oregon Trail, it wasn't just that experience, it was the people you left, you were never going to see again. There's no railroads, there's no telegraph at the time. Your family, friends, neighbors, everyone behind, they're gone. Okay, there's never going to be contact with them again, most likely. Ditto for the Europeans who settled in the Americas, whoever they left behind in Europe, that was a close chapter. They weren't going to do it. Some years later, they went behind and actually led to avoid prosecution, and that's how they ended up in America. For whatever reason, those changes were broken. Native Americans didn't have that. They've been living in the same places for many centuries. And so they weren't quite as footloose, so they had the same degree of wanderlust as most others. And World War II was the first choice for a lot of the first experience really being like that was more immigration. One of the things that came out of World War II was that was an way. Just the fast generations we had enemy and communism and wanted to make sure that did not get inroads here. And that made a lot of Americans look a little bit questioning about the native way of holding things communally. They like I said, tend to not have private ownership of property. They each participate in how their tribe is run. And so they have a not very independent, from the outside perspective, way of looking at it. Western Center, with Western Michigan, and come back a little bit. A lot of this happens at the beginning of, a lot of the action is really begins to happen with the new Congress and the Eisenhower presidency in 1953. So let me tee that up just a little bit here. President Eisenhower had a few concerns overall that could influence his apparent thinking on Indian policy. One of them was the concern to reduce federal government expenditures to try to reduce the size of the national debt. I think it's almost a quaint concept in our time right now. But back then, the federal government had been running pretty much balanced for its entire history up until the Great Depression and World War II. President Eisenhower was wanting to get back to that balanced budget. He thought it was much better for the economy and thus the strength of the country to deal with its external concerns, particularly spread of communism. And so he wanted to try to shrink the federal budget very good. Two, President Eisenhower was very good at taking advice from others where his experience was not that great. And dealing with natives, as I'll get to in a little bit, was one of those areas that there was a lot of the country did not have that much experience with. The population of the country was much more in the eastern and central time zones than it is now. The West was a bit of an enigma to a lot of the country at that time. In fact, let me ask this, quick shorthand to illustrate this. How many of you are aware that the Oregon coast got shelled by the Japanese during World War II? Okay. How many of you are aware there were civilian casualties in Oregon from Japanese bombing in World War II? A few. Not very many knew that. Remember, World War II was the idea. The country was not afraid about its German and Italian enemies at the time. There was a lot of German and Italian people in the United States, and Commander-in-Chief had German surname, right? Contrast that with the treatment of Japanese and Americans and almost all over the West. I knew some people in Portland when I was practicing out there who I wanted to his experience. He's a 9-year-old, came home from school one afternoon, and his parents were not at home. A couple of very official-looking people were, they told him he had 15 minutes to get his things packed, and they were taking him to the train station because he was going to be sent to an internment camp in Utah. And that's supposedly where his parents were. Again, he's 9 years old. He doesn't know, never seen these people before. That's what he's supposed to do. He has a really long day-and-a-half train ride to get to Utah. Just hoping what they said the flight would be somebody would meet him there. And all of that because they had Japanese surname. Your sports fan in 1942 Rose Bowl was not played in Pasadena, California. It was played in Truman, North Carolina. In Duke Stadium, because the government was afraid of having a large assembly of people on the West Coast. So, Native Americans were largely Western issues. That's where most of them were. Not too many of the powers that be in Washington, D.C. had much background with them. And so, President Eisenhower was willing to refer to those who had more experience in there. And give them there's somebody who claimed to do that. And the other one, which I mentioned, was the feeling of trying to prevent any communist inroads in the United States. And the natives had much more of a communal way of conducting the government on the property, providing for their citizens and so on. It's a little bit suspicious that way. A few other things that you can do to the termination policies. Samantha, let's take the next slide and talk a little bit about Code Law 8328. This is not part of the termination policy per se. It shows how it gets led into. What this statute did was try to reduce a jurisdiction issue over who could prosecute crimes committed on Indian reservations. Okay? It wasn't always clear whether that was a federal rule or a state rule or a tribal rule. But Federal Law 288 was set in certain states, the ones listed here. The federal government would no longer be the prosecuting authority for crimes committed on reservations in those states. But rather the state would assume that obligation. about how this worked. One of his comments was that the statute would complete political equality to all Indians. That deals with an issue that was widely understood, but not exactly accurate, which was that Indians were somehow not full citizens in some way. All of that took some time coming. You know, the women got the vote in 1920. Native Americans got the vote in 1924. The minority didn't have it until then. But they were authorized at the time to vote in state elections. So that one, political equality issue is really has to do with what's the role of the tribal government. More on that in a moment. And as second-class citizens, again, that was not so much a legal issue, but I think it was a prejudicial one, because Indians, by and large, live much more among their people on reservations and haven't assimilated as much into greater society. There's a feeling that they were not treated as full citizens. I want to say, you know, looking at it historically, that's accurate, but not for legal purposes, not really legal provisions. It's probably where it largely goes to prejudice at that time. Let's hit the next slide. Samantha, we go there. President Eisenhower wanted the statute to preserve the basic safeguards of the Indians by federal treaties. That didn't really change the Public Law Act 280, but it really just been an termination policy. You know, the statute for safeguard tribal customs and ordinances was not inconsistent with the general laws of the states. The problem with this statute is it put no limits on the state's ability to draft criminal laws that would apply on the reservation to the natives living on the reservation. In other words, the natives would end up not really having any say in the criminal laws at all, except to the extent they were lobbying the state legislature, which in most states they weren't big enough number really to do that effectively. And next one, but the last one of this page is when President Eisenhower showed a concern that would be frequent in his presidency had actually become Indian policy later on. But there's a provision of Law 280 that allowed other states to adopt this provision. Other states on reservations. Now you involve the Indian tribes now. And President Eisenhower expressed his concern about that provision in this last statement here. They effectively negated the opportunity for self-government of the Indians. They would have no say in some of the law making in the reservation. Termination policy. One other thing dealing with the termination policy is let's go to the next one. The Indian Claims Commission, because of public concern over tribes springing lawsuits, say that their treaty rights have never been granted. That's very common. So 1946 Congress established the Indian Claims Commission to resolve Indian treaty rights. They want to deal with the spiritual, which is a 5-year limitation. All claims have to be made within 5 years. It didn't work that way. The Claims Commission lasted over 30 years, and there are some cases that took almost that time to resolve. Okay, they kept getting more and more information, and there's some legal precedents from the history too. Undergraduate law cases that the Claims Commission took some often interesting legal positions to try to negate a lot of the Indian claims. One was the issue where they would achieve as first agencies. Each group, each man, tribe, or several. Some of the non-treaty versus the Indian Claims Commission saying that our land, our band at the time is now not subject to the confiscated. The Indian Claims Commission took the position as saying, sorry, the requirement is first tribe. So to have, the tribes. So the non-treaty band said, okay, if we're part of the tribe, then should be benefits that come to us from the tribe. The Indian Claims Commission said, no, because you're not part of the tribe. You didn't move on to the reservation that we didn't have. So I said, there's no some legal precedents from that. But it is going to be a tangle that's coming out closer to the tribe. Any of these legal claims brought by virtue of the tree rights. Next slide, in 1953, the new Congress passed what's called House Resolution 108, which was to express the intent of Congress to terminate the discrimination for each Indian tribe. As soon as they were able to one of the tribes no longer exist, Indians were no longer as such. That will be shortly, but one time. Next slide, about the studies of the termination. In the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a study done by Indian Affairs to assess the readiness of tribes to be able to no longer have status and assume government take care of the people and so on. Interesting issue. These three studies, none of them use the same criteria, and none of them reach the same actually a lot of tribes. One study would say, oh yes, it's ready, you have to go on here. One of the other studies would say, oh, not for a very long time. Even on the same thing. So there's no such criteria for tribe readiness for termination. So now let's do the next slide, and now get into where the termination policy did develop. Beginning in 1954, Congress began enacting a number of statutes to terminate its relationship with a number of Indian tribes. What termination involved was the Congress enacted a statute saying that this tribe is no longer recognized as an Indian tribe. Indians, the first tribe, no longer qualified for Indian services because you're not an Indian tribe. We don't have a relationship with you if you're not recognized or any other reservation. Those are typically as soldiers. And so, as I get to in a minute, I will get through the details on this. I want to mention who's been championing this. Samantha, I think you go ahead. One more slide, sorry. It did have a champion in the first place, Senator from Utah, New York. So I can say that here. I've never said that presentation in Utah. I have these two from my audience for screening here from the States. I'm probably safe to point that out. He had just been using the member of the Senate in 1953. His own previous life in office was as a member of his local irrigation district. He came to Congress wanting to become a great emancipator of Indians. He gave a lot of speeches, which included his statement that I see these words written blazoned in letters of fire over the heads of the Indians. These people shall be free. We shall be rosy. All we hear about others was to be free from the life. This is constant. Indians were trapped on reservations. The fact that they wanted to be there didn't actually dawn on anybody. But he became champion of the termination policy. And because he was from a western state, he had enough Indian reservations. He got a lot of reference and he got a lot of reference down. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the powers that be in Washington, D.C. was not really familiar with Western affairs at the time. Here's a Western senator who indicated he knew what to do about that. And as I mentioned before, the idea that maybe the Indians wanted to stay where they were was not really a concept. Let's put the next slide, which is actually a page out of my article, which is why I assume this. This is what we call Termination Act in the country. I want to mention a few of them, because I want them. The Monopoly and Clan Act. The Monopoly and Response and Clan Act were considered to be the most related to termination and handle affairs. We look at exercisable logging operations on the reservations. I'll get to a minute, that was a little bit of a rose-colored glasses way of looking at it. And you can see there are a whole lot of other tribes around the country that use such termination acts. Some of the acts that you're supposed to learn specific about just who they were terminating and what exactly the plan was. But these are lists of termination overall. Something more of a I say a lot, it did a number of tribes in large number of states. It wasn't that focused on the so, let's take a look at a couple of these, blue line close to let's do the next slide. I want to talk about non-determination access. Another in this presentation, which President Eisenhower has stated in the signing of the law. As I mentioned, the non-determination in this country had a larger than usual for that part of the country reservation, and we operated a timber operation and employed a number of tribal members there. The act was taken that over time, so you try to adjust and determine how to do that business. Some states, some President Eisenhower state, this bill was developed after extensive consultation with non-union people. I would say that President Eisenhower seemed very attached to this concept that he wanted to make sure that every Indians was based on consultation with Indians. As you might have noticed from what I'm saying to now, that have genuinely not been a part of Indian policy before. The United States has decided to protest Indians and stuff. What is that? They did not ask Indians what they wanted. The government's policy was going to be this issue because of Eisenhower. Wanted to make sure that if they did anything in this area, send communities. I have to say, that was generally not the case. It's probably done with the consent of some Indians, but not very many. That's why it's not a history of fantastic membership of one country, for example. So it's done by Congress largely on the basis of consultation of Indians. The black state nominees are able to manage their access to consultation, but these would not be the case in practice. Next slide. One other statement, President Eisenhower felt statement that these will authorize the other tribes to be a program, authorize the other tribes to realize the full potentialities as productive citizens in the United States. Whenever they would have a contiguous citizen, complete responsibility for managing their affairs. But into the moment, Termination really did the opposite of this because even two tribes felt most it did not work out at all. In society of Oregon, we talk about termination and kind of set very large reservation, also partially first, not a safety, that handles that logging operation. The devil couldn't be in details of the Termination Act because yes, the tribes have a logging operation. They haven't, for the most part, permanent. Bureaucratic affairs at times between the states did not have all the decision-making on shadow and all the reservations of resources. And so the tribe came time to over the logging operation. One of the first problems was the plants was they no longer have the termination of trees on it. They never had to go source the trees before it was on the reservation. That's the long case. The reservation is they have to go get treaties from other parts. They didn't know how to do that. They never negotiated this contract. If you have employees, you know the issue is that it's not just hiring somebody, you got a bunch of parts you got to go through. There's a lot of issues come up here. The Indian tribes never had to deal with that one before. They didn't have. The land and reservation lands. Let's go on to the next slide and talk about a number of issues here. Number of effects of the termination policies of the tribes applied to. Big ones lost of land and businesses. I mentioned most of the reservations were sold and very quickly ended up in the hands of non-natives. A lot of tribal members who were entitled to proceeds of the sale of the reservation were not of age yet. They were younger than 18. The trust had to be set up to hold their interest. And the natives are the trustees before. They didn't have that concept. They still didn't know what to do. There's a lot of urban legends around the time of Oregon about how many attorneys and how many real estate agents retired very soon after the Land Termination Act. All that you go through the lands on that. So anyway, the tribes that had reservations didn't necessarily have all the management skills to take them over. One other big issue of being the land loss was some of the reservation land would be divided up amongst the tribes and issued deeds would be issued to tribal members. However, because tribal members no longer reservation land and tribal members no longer Indians, they all became subject to local county property taxes. Okay, the natives had no experience paying property taxes. Okay, didn't understand what the tax notice was for, and a lot of property going through the property tax. As I mentioned before, termination ended the role of large governments. They had no reservation to govern. They didn't have the tribe to be governed to govern, and they didn't have recognition from the government. They lost the supporting programs because the members of these tribes were no longer Indians. They no longer had access to education benefits and health benefits. Things have been provided under their treaty rights. You know, a lot of Indian treaties would have a provision that the United States would give them a school, build a schoolhouse, and provide a teacher for them. That's why there's a lot of Indian education service. Well, termination basically abrogated those treaty rights. I talked about the contract law concept of this. Termination basically abrogated that. You know, it's the United States saying, thank you very much for the land. You decided because we can do it, we're not going to follow our side of the contract. You know, which I think that too. You know, just that certain mortgage or house or you really need to make a few things and say, sorry, Linda, I don't have to do this anymore. You're on your own. That's kind of what happened here. The states where these tribes got terminated, and they're very unhappy, very cast because they had a lot of people who were being educated by the BIA who are now in public school, among other things. They incurred a lot of expenses that they didn't have to do before. And overall, the fact that they got put into a lot of familiar situations, he tried to have a relatively prosperous before termination were not at all afterwards. The country's trust relationship with the tribes anyway, they ended up much worse off. So then let's do the next slide. Termination is quickly seen to be a mistake. My next line is a little bit off. There's one termination act in 1962. And it didn't take very long, like I said, the first termination acts were adopted in 1954. By the time of President Kennedy's campaign in 1960, he was already advocating that policy be ended. He didn't really put anything on it in his presidency that did with President Johnson, although in President Johnson's 1968 address, State of the Union address to Congress, he used for the first time the term self-determination for Indian policy. That we ought to change it and let the Indians be involved in what policy was. Let's go to the next slide, please. The real change in policy came from Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, when he became president in 1969. One of his first acts was to recreate for an American Indian Policy Review Commission and gave the direction to say, we want to make a change, which is how can we get the Indians more participating in the benefits of American life without having to stop, without having to make them non-Indian. And the Policy Review Commission quickly, by the next year, began issuing its report saying that what we need to do is adopt this policy, self-determination. In other words, for the first time in the country's history, let's ask the natives how this would work best for them. The cornerstone of that, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Systems Act, was passed in 1975, and let's go to the next slide. Self-determination has continued to be the country's Indian policy, the present, which is let's have natives have the biggest role in determining Indian policy. Let's ask them what works for them instead of trying to dictate to them. A couple other things I want to say here too. Bureau of Indian Affairs has largely changed from that time to being a paternalistic organization to being a service provider, and the bulk of its staff are now natives. It's like I said, it's really changed around. In fact, for many years, on reservations, they always felt BIA did stand for Bureau of Indian Affairs. them, that was really the relationship they had. Beginning in the late, like I said, early 1974, Congress saw the fall of the termination policy and began adopting restoration acts to restore the terminated tribes as such, recognizing the Indian tribes as their member status of unions, and bring them back into the fold that way. Most, but not all, the terminated tribes have been terminated. And it's given tribal governments, that's given tribal governments much larger roles, as in very frequently BIA will administer programs through tribal governments so that they were involved in how they work and who they work for. And that has made a lot of those much more effective over time. The next to last point I'm going to touch on too, Restoration Act's initial restored tribes of federal status did address the issue of reservations at all. Now, most of the terminated tribes have gotten reservations back, but I have to say, it's not like it's the same thing. Let's do the next slide. That's the map I'm going to show you. I mentioned the clans have, as you saw in the chart, clans have the largest reservation in the terminated. That red line on the outside, that was the pre-reservation clan for the clan Indian reservation. The darker line on the inside, that's what it is. Okay. That's the amount of land the clans got back. If we go to the next slide, this is the Western Oregon tribes had. It was about 1/4 of the entire Oregon coast. That got whittled down to be about 1/4 this size by the time of the Western Oregon Termination Act. It's still about 250,000 acres. If we look at the next slide, there has to be a circle on this one because that's what the reservation is now. It's about 4,000 acres. Restoration land was not done with the basis of what the natives had before. It was done on the basis how to make something so there's something on an economic base. So I would say the effects of termination in a lot of ways are still around. Next slide, Stan. The epilogue on the termination policy. The BIA has given us much more staff on much more responsive to that. The BIA's focus is on managing the service organization, that's where the Indian Health Services House, education is now. Interesting, tribal governments managed to survive through this. Even during the termination years, they stayed in touch with a lot of their members and managed to do that. And it's gotten much better for natives overall. I wouldn't say not enough, but I've got a few minutes, but I'd like to take questions from you. And after that, I'll give you my plain comments. So, any questions that I can respond to?
If you have a question, I'll come to you.
Yeah.
That on?
Yeah.
No, I have a voice that projects.
Okay.
Recent Supreme Court ruling about legal status of prosecuting Indians, even though they're not in tribal lands.
Okay. You're probably referencing the third case in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is very challenging in Indian law because it was an Indian country for a long time. And so a lot of Oklahoma tribes have different legal strictures for status than tribes in the rest of the country. They line up on a lot of things, but they come from different pieces of legislation. What the third case said was for one of the southern tribes, Muskogee Creek, I think it was, held that, I'll try to catch it again, that the tribes, Congress had never disestablished tribal reservations, so a lot of the area of the state of Oklahoma thought they could prosecute natives on, they cannot. The limit on state jurisdiction is for tribal members within the reservation, the tribe is the governing authority. The state does not have any authority. I would say we've got interstate situation in Utah, the limited authority, it's part of it, one of the tribes that got terminated. They've been reinstated in part because of that mismatch. There's a town in Utah in which 60% of the real estate within the city limits is also within the limits of the limited authority reservation. And so there are, I believe, 8, maybe 9, 10 circuit Court of Appeals cases saying, Duchesne County, I'm sorry, but you can't go, even though they committed a crime off reservation, you can't go onto reservation and arrest a tribal member there unless the tribe authorizes you to do so. You don't have jurisdiction over the tribal member on tribal land. But the county and the tribe can't work that out. The county refuses to acknowledge that. Actually, 4 of those decisions were written by a 10th Circuit Justice Neil Gorsuch, who's now on the Supreme Court. But yeah, that murder and what's happened with that case is still sort of improved in a lot of ways because there becomes federal court decisions. The same concept applies to other tribes in Oklahoma. Though a lot of the reservation land passed as non-Indian ownership, it's still within the original reservation boundaries. Therefore, the state does not have permanent jurisdiction. Okay, that's any others? Good question, by the way. I'm getting really interested how that's going to impact tribal tax jurisdiction too. Who wants to collect property taxes on that land?
I have a question that I also like to add on what you just said about Florida. And in a previous position, I worked with Clinical Trial Florida. And they got a share on court system in 2014. And they went through a battle kind of similar. It involved a child who had been removed from a home, who was native, but did not live on reservation. And there was a big battle in Florida about who had jurisdiction over where to place this child. And I believe it went all the way to the court.
Yeah, the Supreme Court, I'll jump in, the Supreme Court just issued its decision in what's called the Raheem case, which involves the Indian Tribe Welfare Act, which basically holds that if a native tribe comes in the state foster care system, the tribe basically gets the first right of first refusal to find a foster place for it. The concern was the vast majority of natives who came into foster care were getting adopted or placed with non-native families off reservations using the culture. So that Indian Tribe Welfare Act was upheld in that case, although on standing grounds, basically those contested in their standing for the case. So good.
And then my question, I'm sorry, but my question really is that also working with them, I talked to a lot of tribal members who were impacted by the Indian Relation Act. Because the Seminole tribe becomes a recognized tribe in 1967. And they talk about, one of the things they talk about the most is the push for assimilation.
Yeah.
Did you have that same problem in the West? But I mean, they talked about boarding schools and all of these things.
Yeah.
But there's the effort to, I don't know, Americanize them? I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah. It has been, that has placed, the concept of assimilation has generally, prior to self-determination, was kind of always the aim of federal government's Indian policy. And that time is up. Brian, I can field any questions after this, but my party comment, if I can share that. Termination policy is really the last policy the government has tried to impose, really assimilation on Native Americans. If the government had the idea you're supposed to be a certain way, and we're going to try to box you, we're going to force that on you, coerce you one way or the other to do that. In 40 years since I wrote the article that led to my presentation here, I have been fortunate of dealing with a lot of Native Americans as friends and colleagues in business and other circumstances. I'm very glad to know them as colleagues and friends. They are very accomplished people in virtually every aspect of life. They're attorneys and medical professionals. They're teachers. They are farmers and ranchers. They are leaders of businesses, nonprofit organizations. They do all. In other words, they become what the policy was supposed to be, but they've been able to do that without having to be non-Indian at all. Okay? Most of them, they still speak the native languages. They maintain and pass along their cultural practices and so on. We don't often realize that Indian natives have had plan new relationships that go back hundreds of years, and they remain true to those. And so I want to say that the improvement has been to say that, you know, the policy of the country, frankly, never benefited from and never needed to be trying to make the natives non-American. What it really needed to be was make the Americans have a little better view of what being American was. And that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Walch, for that wonderful presentation. I want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I also want to say thank you to our virtual audience, and know that we are having some sound policy issues. Hopefully, we can fix that for you, because the video will live on our YouTube page in perpetuity, hopefully. And so hopefully we can fix that in some sort of way so that you can come back and look good and it's better for you. We always want to thank our sponsors. So that is the Just Cook Foundation and the Eisenhower Foundation. We do not be able to have these programs without them. And so we want to say thank you to them always. And then we just want to remind you that we do have lunch and learns every month on the fourth Thursday of the month. And we have our evenings at eat every other month on the evenings at 7 p.m. And so we invite you to join us for that. And if you'd like to know what our next program is going to be, you can join our email list, or you can follow us on social media, and it will all be there for you, or you can check our website. And if there's nothing else, I would say thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Do you know what the next one will be about?
Is